So let's quickly review the joints in the wrist and the hand, and we can start with the radiocarpal joint, which is that, again, the distal concave radius articulating with the convex carpals. There's a large capsule that encloses the joint, and as a consequence of that capsule enclosing the joint, it really mechanically links those joints or those bones together. So it's attached proximally to the distal ends of the radius of the ulna and proximal row of carpals. And again, it's reinforced by the dorsal and the volar or plantar radiocarpal ligament. The intercarpal joints are plain synovial joints that are glide superior and inferior with flexion and extension. The proximal row again includes the scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, and the pisiform, and the distal row includes the trapezium, the trapezoid, capitate, and the hamate. And one of the things to keep in mind is the carpal tunnel, which we'll come back and visit in a minute. The carpal metacarpal joint are typically plain synovial joints, with the exception of the thumb, which is a sellar joint. And remember that sellar joint is biarticular, biaxial, and will move in with 2 degrees of freedom in 2 planes. So the trapezium articulates with the saddle shape of the first metacarpal, and it does have its own separate cavity from the rest of the carpals. The metacarpal phalangeal joints are condyloid joints, both of which have an oval articulated surface. When we look at the interphalangeal joints, they are uniaxial hinge joints and reinforced dorsally by the extensor expansion. So let's take a look at the carpal tunnel, which is created by the flexor retinaculum here, which goes proximally from the tubercle of the scaphoid to the pisiform, and distally from the trapezium to the hook of the hamate. And its contents includes the flexor digitorum superficialis. Its contents includes the flexor digitorum superficialis, the flexor digitorum profundus, the flexor pollicis longus, and the median nerve. And what is excluded is the flexor carpi radialis, which has its own tunnel, as does the ulnar nerve. So the extensor mechanism, which really consists of the extensor expansion, the extensor digitorum, the dorsal and the volar interossei, and lubrical muscles. So this is a fairly complex extensor mechanism that allows us to extend our individual finger joints. So the extensor digitorum tendon passes deep to the extensor retinaculum, then flattens out onto the aponeurotic hood of the distal metacarpal phalangeal joint. Okay, so we have this expansion that becomes the aponeurotic hood, or the dorsal aponeurosis. Now, some of the fibers from the flattened hood is joined by tendon fibers from the interossei muscles that arise from the sides of the metacarpals. So now we start to see tendons arising from the interossei muscles. Some of the fibers from the interossei muscle go deep to insert into the proximal phalanx, and other fibers join with and become part of the hood that wraps around the proximal phalanx. So that is the proximal phalanx. The hood splits into 3 segments just proximal to the head of the proximal phalanx. So we have these 3 specific segments. The central tendon crosses the proximal interphalangeal joint and inserts into the base of the middle phalanx. So we have this extension into the base of the middle phalanx. 2 lateral bands pass on either side of the central tendon, cross the proximal joint, and reunite to insert into a single terminal tendon in the distal phalanx. So we cross and create a terminal tendon. The central tendon and both lateral bands receive contributing fibers from the interosseous, with the radial lateral band also receiving the lumbrical tendons. The lateral bands are interconnected dorsally by a triangular band of superficial fibers known as the triangular or transverse retinacular ligament. The dorsal hood is also attached to the transverse metacarpal ligament. So how does it work? Well, we have to look at its function through the full range of motion. So at the metacarpal phalangeal joint, the extensor digitorum tendon passes dorsal to the joint axis. Active contraction pulls the hood proximally over the metacarpal phalangeal joint and extends the proximal phalanx. The interossei and the lumbricals run volar to the metacarpal phalangeal axis, thus creating a flexion force at the joint. So I have a flexion force created here and an extension force created here. When the extensor digitorum and the intrinsic hand muscles contract simultaneously, the metacarpal phalangeal joint will typically extend because the force of the extensor digitorum is greater than the intrinsic hand muscles. Now at the proximal interphalangeal joint, here, the central tendon and the lateral bands cross dorsally and volarly by the oblique retinacular ligaments. The extensor digitorum interossei and lumbricals all are capable of applying an extensor force at the proximal interphalangeal joint. So the axis runs below and we have an extension moment above. Now most likely, an active contraction of the extensor digitorum alone cannot produce sufficient tension in the central tendon or the lateral bands to overcome the passive forces of the long finger flexors at the interphalangeal joints. Consequently, we have to look at active extension of the interossei or the lumbricals muscles is necessary to extend the proximal interphalangeal joint. The distal interphalangeal joint is tied to the proximal joint. Consequently, PIP extension will result in distal interphalangeal joint extension based on the active and passive forces that are created. So let's take a look at how finger function then is created. Let's review quickly the muscles that are responsible for finger extension. And we can see in our model here we have the extensor digitorum, the extensor digiti minimi, the extensor indicis. And if I slide down, we can see that tendon moving all the way to the distal phalanx. We have dorsal interossei, and we have lumbricals, and deep to the lumbricals we have palmar interossei. So dorsal interossei, lumbricals, palmar interossei. And as we learned earlier with our extensor mechanism, we can see how they attach into the extensor mechanism. So when I look at finger extension, moving from the flex now into the extended position, we can see that central pull on at each one of those segments. So let's take a quick minute to look at accessory joint motions, and remembering that I have a hinge joint, single articular hinge, single axis hinge joint, and my PIP and my DIP joints. So as I go into extension, I have a fixed convex surface with a moving concave surface. So as I roll into extension, I've got to recognize that I have to have a dorsal glide in the distal bone. So if I'm looking at my proximal interphalangeal joint, so my proximal phalanx moving or fixed with a moving middle phalanx into that extended position, I'll have a dorsal roll and a extended roll, and with a dorsal glide. So glide and roll are in the same direction. So let's take a look at finger flexion. And our primary finger flexors are the flexor digitorum superficialis and the flexor digitorum profundus. And we can see that the uniqueness between these two is that the superficialis does come down and split, attaching into the middle phalanx, while the profundus continues down to insert into the distal phalanx. So I also have to consider what I'm looking at when I do flex my fingers, because as we can see with the long tendons, the extrinsic tendons, they're going to flex all the way through. But remember, also on our hand is we've got the lumbricals again. And remember, our lumbricals and our interossei were responsible for some of those extensor moments for the distal joints, but they are responsible for finger flexion at the metacarpal phalangeal joint. So when I start looking at the motion, I'm going to turn this around a little bit. We can start to see that I have my long flexor tendons controlling the distal joints, but I do have my short intrinsic muscles assisting at the proximal joints, at the metacarpal phalangeal joints. So those are the muscles responsible for finger flexion. Now we can consider a couple of different things with thumb extension. And First, let's take a look at the muscles. Extensor pollicis longus attaching into the distal phalanx. And remember that the thumb is part of the sellar joint, so we have motion occurring in two planes. We also have the extensor pollicis brevis attaching into the base of the proximal phalanx. And we have the abductor pollicis longus that will assist in extension in addition to abduction. We'll look at abduction of the thumb in a second. So when I look at the motion, we can see that motion of the extensors creates that motion at the carpal metacarpal joint, at the sellar joint, as well as the proximal and distal. Now remember, with the thumb there's no middle phalanx, so we just have a distal and a proximal phalanx. Let's turn this around and take a look, and we can see that with thumb motion, extension comes out to the side more. So our flexion and extension motions in the thumb are in a little bit different plane than they are in the fingers. Thumb flexion occurs with contractions of a number of muscles, again starting with the flexor pollicis longus attaching to the distal phalanx, with additional help from the flexor pollicis brevis, which is an intrinsic thumb muscle. That's kind of that large mass that we see on the thenar eminence, the thumb side, the bulky muscle side of the palm. In addition to that, we also have the adductor pollicis that's an assister, and part of what stabilizes the flexor retinaculum is the palmaris longus. So when I look at that motion occurring, again, we need to consider that flexion in opposition of extension occurs in a little bit different plane than finger flexion occurs in. So we can see that motion coming across the palm of the hand. Start to see it from a couple of different angles. So we can see that tendon running through and creating that motion that is, again, moving across the palm of the hand as the proximal and the metacarpal phalangeal joint and the carpal metacarpal joint all move into a flexed position. But again, that is occurring across the hand. So movement at the radiocarpal joint is primarily a gliding of the carpal row on the radius and the radial ulnar disc. There's actually no muscular forces that are applied to the proximal row of carpals. So motion going into flexion or extension really serves as a mechanical. The proximal row then really serves as a mechanical link between the radius and the distal carpals. So muscularly, when I look at wrist extensors, the extensor carpi ulnaris, we've already looked at the extensor digitorum, but again, because it does pass that wrist joint, it will have a mechanical influence, and again is under the extensor retinaculum. The extensor carpi radialis brevis and the extensor carpi radialis longus. So as I look at motion into extension, we can take a look at what occurs. So when the wrist is moved toward extension from a fully flexed position, so from this position here moving into a position of extension, the motion is initiated at the distal row with the capitate at the center. Now, mid-carpal motion will occur with the distal carpals gliding on a relatively fixed proximal set of bones. When the wrist hits a neutral position there, the scaphoid and the capitate are drawn into a closed packed position. So from neutral to about 45 degrees of extension, the extensor force now moves to the combined unit of the distal carpal row and the scaphoid on a relatively fixed lunate and triquetrum. After about 45 degrees, the scaphoid and lunate are drawn into a closed pack position, resulting in all the carpals working as a single unit. The remaining extension occurs on the proximal carpals moving against the radius and the radial disc. So we need to consider initially motion occurring distally to mid-range, proximally to end range, everything moving as a unit. Taking a look at wrist flexion, we have all the muscles that cross the wrist, including those finger flexors that we have talked about previously, including the flexor digitorum superficialis and the flexor digitorum profundus. But in addition to those, we do have the flexor carpi ulnaris, the palmaris longus in those of us who have one, flexor carpi radialis, and the flexor pollicis longus. So those are the muscles that are responsible for wrist flexion, and they all do cross under the flexor retinaculum and through the not all of them cross through the carpal tunnel, as the flexor carpi ulnaris has its own attachment, so we can see that attachment outside of the flexor retinaculum and the carpal tunnel. Wrist abduction, or radial deviation, is a synergistic motion that occurs when we have extensors and flexors contracting simultaneously. So, taking a look at all the muscles responsible for radial deviation, we includes the extensor pollicis longus, the abductor pollicis longus, the extensor pollicis brevis, but most specifically the extensor carpi radialis brevis, the extensor carpi radialis longus, working together with the flexor carpi radialis. So when I look at all of those muscles together, we can see that I get lateral movement or abduction of the hand against the radius. So this is radial deviation. When I look at the opposite motion, or wrist adduction, I can see that I have a synergistic contraction with the flexor carpi ulnaris and the extensor carpi ulnaris. And we can look and see there are common attachments occurring, creating a synergistic pull into wrist adduction or ulnar deviation. So we can see that motion towards the fifth. So we've had a good example of an opportunity to take a look at hand movements, hand motions, and the muscles responsible for those motions, and review your text, as there's excellent information that will further enlighten us on some of the specifics of hand motion and the complexities that occur with the intentional movements that occur with our hand when we reach for things and grasp and pull up and push up and lift and carry and all the things that we need to do with our hands. So we'll start next time looking at the wrist, or the elbow and forearm, and the motions that occur at that complex joint. So until next time.